Hello. I'm wearing what I call my archaeology shirt to provide a kind of contrast to the subject of today's video, and that is going to be the accents of British monarchs over time. So that's going to be an analysis of the accents of British monarchs that we have recordings of the voices of, and it's also going to be a little look into how much we can tell about the pronunciation of monarchs in the past before sound recording equipment was invented. And I know it's become a bit of a shtick to sort of correct misconceptions and things. I don't want that to become too much of a thing in these videos because I know it can get a bit grating. But there is a very big one about RP, which is sort of received pronunciation, the sort of upper class posh dialect of the southeast of England, that I think does need addressing, because every time I've mentioned it in the past I've had comments or very occasionally emails saying things like, well, RP is just it's a constructed accent. It's designed to sound posh or upper class. And it's absolutely true that now that RP exists and is established as the kind of accent of posh people, it's definitely something some people aspire to. It's definitely something that people may imitate aspects of in order to make themselves sound posher or to make themselves come across better, or, if they're talking in a formal context, they might see certain aspects of RP as important to convey that formality. But it's not something that people sat around and invented. The phonology of RP is not deliberately designed to sound posh. It's got all the hallmarks, of a naturally occurring dialect of English. Because the last time I said this, there were a few people that were quite surprised by it, and understandably surprised by it. I'll go through a couple of sort of thought exercises to illustrate the point. So I'm going to say a word, cut. What word am I saying? Well, it depends on your point of view. I'm saying cut in an older, more conservative RP accent, and I'm saying cat in a broad, conservative Cumbrian accent. Whether it sounds posh depends entirely on which accent you're thinking in terms of. So if you think of a Cumbrian saying "Tbrún cat," it sounds probably not posh. I don't know how Cumbrian sounds to most people. Whereas if you think of an RP speaker saying "cut the ribbon," that probably sounds very posh. You could argue it's to do with the way lexical sets are arranged. So, for example, in RP we're talking about the cut, mut, utter lexical set, but in Cumbrian we're talking about the cut, watter, sat lexical set. But sets are only meaningful in the context of the language you're talking about. So, to a monolingual Mandarin or Arabic or Swedish speaker, if there is such a thing as a monolingual Swedish speaker, if they hear cut, it doesn't matter to them which lexical set that word is in, because English lexical sets have no meaning to them. To them it doesn't sound posh, it doesn't sound rough, it just sounds like a foreign word. You could argue RP speakers tend to speak with, for example, tensor vowels or something. Well, that's not true either. I live in an area where a lot of people speak RP in casual situations. I know younger speakers, I know older speakers, and vowels are often very lax, as you'll actually see in this video. And what we might call slurring speech, although linguists tend to avoid that term, is very common in RP when people are speaking quickly and casually. It's not even that RP sounds more similar to standard French or standard German or classical Latin. I'll put up the vowel inventories for you to compare, and also the vowel inventory of Cockney English. This is not to be confused with formalities and grammatical constructions that are often associated with RP, some of which do seem to have come about as a result of people wanting to talk in a more refined way. For example, there's that whole thing about not putting a preposition at the end of a sentence. That's never historically been a rule of English. I'm pretty sure it's lifted from classical Latin, although somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. But the sound system itself is just an ordinary regional sound system. So let's start from the beginning. Queen Victoria is the first monarch who might have had her voice recorded, although it's very important to mention it's disputed whether it's actually Queen Victoria. It's also difficult to hear what she's saying, and we can only really pick out a few loose phonemes. One thing you'll notice is that it's not a German accent. So while Queen Victoria would probably have spoken both English and German at a native level, there's not much reason to think she would have had a German accent when speaking English, or for that matter, an English accent when speaking German. Most natively bilingual people are pretty good at keeping the two languages separate without one bleeding into the other. As with a lot of very high status RP accents, the vowel in the word can is slightly broken. Can. The vowel in B is slightly centralised, even to the point I would transcribe it with this IPA character. B. All instances of schwa, which are the unstressed central vowel, are fronted slightly, so instead of we have e. The short vowel in forgotten is very interesting in that it's very, very unrounded, and I would transcribe it narrowly using the unrounded character. Forgotten, forgotten. I couldn't find any recordings of Edward VII, so we'll go straight to George V, who was the first king to record Christmas broadcasts.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire. I take it as a good omen that wireless should have reached its present perfection.
We have the rest of the vowels here that Queen Victoria, if it was Queen Victoria, couldn't provide us with. And things are largely very similar, but the am vowel is a monophthong, so instead of am, you have am. The through vowel is slightly fronted, so instead of being oo, it's oo, through. The one vowel is central and low, one. Like with Queen Victoria, the vowel in marvel is a bit fronted, marvel, and the got vowel is distinctly unrounded, so modern. We also have examples of the diphthongs I, ow, and most strikingly, o. That's very unusual for a modern Southern English accent. It would normally start from a more central or even slightly fronted point, so no or no. But he says o.
Omen, omen, omen.
Now for Edward VIII, who was only king for a few months before he abdicated.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak.
King George VI is a difficult one because he had a couple of speech impediments. The most noticeable one was his stammer, but he also had an impediment called rhotacism, and this is the inability to pronounce the alveolar approximant sound r, r. And it's normally realised as something like a bilabial fricative, like a V, but made with both lips pressed together instead of one lip against one set of teeth. V, v. People often hear this as a w sound just because we don't have the bilabial fricative in most dialects of English, but it's very rarely actually realised as w, at least in his speech it's normally v, v.
In this grave hour, and perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself.
And now we come to the current Queen, Elizabeth II.
Happy Christmas. 25 years ago, my grandfather broadcast the first of these Christmas messages. Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day. My own family often gather round to watch television, as they are at this moment, and that is how I imagine you now.
The vowel in happy again has a slight central off glide, ha, ha. The vowel in 20 is slightly higher than the vowel in happy, so they're not actually merged as far as I can hear. And the vowel in around, that is the ow, has its final point, because it's a diphthong, so it has a starting point and an end point. The end point is slightly more fronted than it would be in a lot of other accents, so it comes out something like around, around. And that's very typical of RP accents and of southeastern accents in general. And in the interest of documenting change a bit further, we'll include, barring some surprising circumstances, the next monarch.
Secretaries of State, Ladies and gentlemen, I must say I was enormously touched to have been asked here this evening, along with both my sons, to launch this really remarkable series. It is also a much-awaited opportunity to pay tribute to and thank Sir David Attenborough.
Prince Charles's speech, I think, more closely resembles general southeastern English speech than his mother's does. So, for instance, the vowel in the word touched sounds to me, it might just be that I'm not very used to transcribing things phonetically, but it sounds to me like it's more like my vowel rather than the lower, more fronted vowel that's been used in the speech of other monarchs. And you also have this ow diphthong with the fronted final target, ow, something like that, which is, as I say, typical of the Queen's speech as well. Now, what can we say about the accents of monarchs in the distant past? Well, you can tell a certain amount about people's accents from their writing, especially if you have examples of rhyming couplets, so poetry is helpful, but you can only go so far with it, and I'll explain why. A lot of our reconstructions of past stages of English rely on there being an intermediate stage between an earlier variety of English and a dialect of modern English. And that's barring very obvious things that show up in spelling, like a particular sound being elided or something like that. So we reconstruct broad pathways from earlier stages of English to modern dialects of English, and these pathways are very likely to represent how a lot of people spoke, but the speech of a given individual person does not necessarily lie on one of those pathways. It may be an offshoot. We can reconstruct broad temporal and regional stages of English because we have large corpuses of text in those stages, and if we're lucky, someone at the time might have provided some linguistic description of how they spoke. And we have the modern dialects that descended from that stage. So what we're reconstructing is, if you like, a common way of speaking at that time, in that place, that may have formed the basis for modern ways of speaking in that place. We can't pinpoint the speech of a specific individual person because we don't have all that information for a specific person. So if we take Elizabeth I as an example, she wrote poetry, and this poetry accords pretty closely to ordinary Southern English poetry of the time. There are some rhyming couplets that don't rhyme nowadays, but this isn't unique to her writing. These same rhyming couplets, for example, rhyme in Shakespeare's sonnets. As far as we can tell from her writing, there's no discernible difference between her accent and anybody else's living in southern England at the time. Monarchs around that time seemed to use, for example, the same kinds of elisions as everyone else was using in casual and formal speech, but whether the vowel qualities differed a little bit, like they do in modern royal accents, we just can't access that information. Another confounding thing here is that the Tudors in particular existed emerging from the Great Vowel Shift. So Henry VII was born in the early throes of the Great Vowel Shift in 1457. So if we presume that because he's a monarch he was speaking more conservatively, then we could give his speech pre-Vowel Shift values. But if we assume he was talking pretty much like anybody else at the time, we might assume later values. Remember that just because he was the king does not mean he was speaking more conservatively than everyone else. We can be even less confident about Henry VIII. Given that he was born in the 1490s, I think by his adulthood it's almost inevitable that some aspects of the Great Vowel Shift would have affected his speech. So I'll read a stanza from one of his poems, first in a way that assumes he was speaking more conservatively, and then in a way that assumes he was speaking more up to date with the sound changes that were happening at the time. As dholly groweth grain, with Evie all alone, when floors cannot be seen, and grain-wood leaves be gone. As dholly groweth green, with Evie all alone, when floors cannot be seen, and greenwood leaves be gone. And that's not to mention little personal variations in pronunciation he might have had. Both these reconstructions are general for the time period and the region, and are not personalised to Henry VIII at all. All we can say is that the poetic metre here shows he thought it was appropriate to reduce the definite article, the word the, in unstressed positions. So the metre, which he sticks pretty well to elsewhere, tells us that it's probably not meant to be read like the holly. It's probably meant to be dholly. Another thing the metre tells us is that flowers was pronounced with one syllable, something like floors. Finally, the rhyme scheme tells us that alone and gone rhyme in his accent. All of these things are pretty standard for the time and the place, so alone and gone only stopped being in the same lexical set fairly recently, and in some conservative dialects they still rhyme. If you tried to reconstruct the speech of the current Queen using only some poetry she'd written, You might notice some weird lexical set differences. So for instance, thorn and gone rhyme in her accent as thorn and gorn. As far as I know, you don't get this kind of thing with Tudor monarchs, so I suppose you could say that counts a bit towards the idea that they spoke more or less like normal southern people of the time, at least pronunciation-wise. Another caveat that I'll always add in these videos, regional accents in the 1500s were probably more diverse even than they are today, but here we're talking about specifically southeastern accents. As a note to end on, at some point I'm going to do a video on historical awareness of linguistic concepts, and in the spirit of that I saw a blog post recently about something I had no idea about. I'll link the post in the description. I'll encourage you to give it a read and a listen. It's by an Alex Foreman, and it's about a man in the early 1600s who actually recorded his own speech in a rudimentary form of phonetic transcription, and the author of the post reads one of Shakespeare's sonnets in the pronunciation this man describes. On the same blog there are lots of other interesting recordings. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.